From around AD 800 to the 11th century, a vast number of Scandinavians left their homeland to seek their fortunes elsewhere. These seafaring warriors, known collectively as Vikings or Norsemen, began by raiding coastal sites, especially undefended monasteries in the British Isles. Over the next 3 centuries, they would leave their mark as pirates, raiders, traders, and settlers on much of Britain and the European continent, as well as parts of modern-day Russia, Iceland, Greenland, and Newfoundland. Most of the Vikings, whose activities are best known, came from the areas now known as Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Their common ground, and what made them different from the European peoples they confronted, was that they came from a foreign land and they were not civilized in the usual understanding of the word, and most importantly, they were not Christians, but pagans. For centuries, the Vikings continued their conquest and colonization of other lands. Around the 8th century, and continuing for another 400 years, a talented and aggressive group of Christian missionaries evangelized the Scandinavians, and by the start of the 11th century, the Viking Age, as we now know it, came to an end. Also at that time, all Scandinavian kingdoms had converted to Christianity. Today, much of Scandinavian culture and history continues to be honored, especially by fraternal organizations such as the Vasa Order of America, and in particular, Chicago's Austin Lodge. As noted earlier, the early Vikings were adventurous sailors and sailed the seas in ships like these. The Viking ship that sailed to the 1893 World's Fair from Norway to Chicago is an identical replica of a first-century Gokstad vessel. It still exists and rests today at a Scandinavian park near Chicago. Its story, beginning over 100 years ago, needs to be told today. 19th century Chicago saw many changes in the Windy City, and by 1893 it was decided to hold a World's Fair in Chicago's Jackson Park. Dedicated by then Chicago Mayor Harrison, the event was not a Scandinavian event, though Scandinavian nations built exhibits and buildings at the fair. It was, however, called the World Columbian Exposition, honoring famed explorer Christopher Columbus. Fair planners designed the fair to be a uniquely Chicago-style celebration of America's discovery. Throughout 1892, elaborate buildings and exhibits slowly transformed what had been an undeveloped mudflat in the Jackson Park area into a sparkling white city. It was an extravagant display of the technological and humanitarian advances of the 19th century. It was to also highlight the century's intellectual and ethical advances and to create a once-in-a-lifetime event that offered a platform for noted speakers and religious leaders as well. British social reformer William T. Stead, who wrote the controversial book If Christ Came to Chicago, was present at the fair. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, led by Frances Willard, addressed other moral issues, in addition to its usual focus on opposing the liquor trade. Famed 19th century evangelist Dwight L. Moody also preached at numerous evangelistic events in the city at the time. It was into this sea of technological and cultural change that the famed 1893 Viking ship sailed into a harbor in Chicago's Jackson Park area. The ship had sailed all the way from Norway without any help from other vessels. The captain was Magnus Andersen, who defied the Atlantic storms and proved that rumors that Vikings could very well have made the crossing to America long before Columbus could have been true. Captain Andersen and his crew of 11 were welcomed in the United States as heroes. The story of this ship actually began in 1880, when the first authentic Viking ship was discovered and excavated. Before the Gokstad ship was found, no one actually knew what a Viking ship had looked like, and even less, how it had been navigated. The excavation of this ship was big news. and the Chicago Exposition was very keen to exhibit this sensational find. However, the ship was regarded as a national treasure and therefore not allowed to leave the country. Magnus Andersen consequently wrote an article in his own newspaper proposing that a replica of the Gokstad be built and sailed to America, Chicago in particular. Magnus Andersen first went to sea at the age of 15 and was a shipmaster by the time he was just 23. He was known as an unconventional and creative thinker at the time. It was these traits that made the first crossing of the Atlantic by a modern Viking ship possible. The Norwegian state that was in a union with Sweden liked the captain's idea, but thought the voyage would be too risky, and Magnuson was forced to raise the money for the voyage himself. The ship's name was at first to be called Leif Erikson, but this was rejected as being too controversial for an exposition dedicated to Columbus, so it was changed to the Viking. 7,000 cheering spectators watched the launch of the Viking on its journey from Norway to Chicago. On April 30th, the Viking left Bergen for North America. The trip took 27 days, and Captain Magnuson said the transatlantic voyage was largely uneventful. The Viking first arrived in New Haven, Connecticut on June 13, 1893. Here the crew was honored with a parade and a banquet and a reception at a famous mansion. There was more music, salutes, and fireworks as the journey continued. This kind of royal treatment became almost standard at the stops in New York City, Albany, Syracuse, Rochester, and Buffalo in New York State. The Viking was also cheered on to Cleveland, Ohio, Detroit, Milwaukee, Evanston, Illinois, and all the way to Jackson Park in Chicago. Captain Andersen estimated that some 30,000 stories were written about the Viking by the 2,000 daily newspapers and 14,000 weeklies in the United States. Everyone was talking about the Viking ship. When the Viking ship neared Chicago, the ship was met by over 50 steamships with some 50,000 cheering people on board. The day she arrived at the Columbian Exposition, the fair had over 129,000 visitors. That compared to only 89,000 visitors the day that the replicas of Columbus ships arrived. Captain Andersen's Viking ship became one of the greatest attractions at the World Columbian Exposition and was finally donated to the city of Chicago when the World's Fair ended. The ship remained moored in a lagoon adjacent to the Field Columbian Museum in Jackson Park for over 2 decades. It was eventually moved to a small shed-type building at the Lincoln Park Zoo on Chicago's north side, where it languished for years and was visited by more of Chicago's infamous pigeons than admiring visitors, many of whom would not have known of its glorious past. In 1994, the Lincoln Park Zoo announced that it needed the space where the Viking ship was for future zoo expansion, and the ship was moved to Good Templar Park in suburban Chicago. In 2007, the Viking was listed as one of the 10 most endangered landmarks in the state. At this point, the Viking is awaiting complete restoration before its current condition declines even further. In the meantime, we at Vasa Order of America Austin Lodge can continue to honor Captain Andersen, his ship, and crew with this new documentary.